when was the first time I was in Sheffield? And that really took me back, actually, because the first time I was in Sheffield, I was trying to remember the year, I think it was 2005, and it was the Fem 05 conference, the feminist conference. It was very much a starting force behind what you might describe as the resurgence of the feminist movement. Some of you may know Kat Banyard and Feminista, and that really grew out of the Sheffield-based movement. It was the Fem conferences. And I have to say that actually looking at the poster the Exchange has here, and looking at the gender balance of the speakers on the poster, maybe it's time for another Fem conference in Sheffield. Although I do have to say, to be fair to the current committee, I'm told this dates back at least 2 years, and so the current committee aren't responsible. So don't go and beat them up about it afterwards, but talk to them about possibly a new poster. And that's particularly telling on today of all days, because many of you might know that today is Equal Pay Day. This is the day that, given that women on average earn 85% that men do, after today, the women of Britain are collectively working for nothing until the end of the year. If you look at the hashtag Equal Pay Day, you'll find out a lot more about that on Twitter. So I think that's something coming to Sheffield as a feminist haven that I've really got to note. And I'm also told that the current committee also deserves credit, because the first speaker before me was one of the founders of the Stop Page 3, that's page 3 of the Sun, for anyone who doesn't realise, campaign. And that's particularly fitting because you may know that Green MP Caroline Lucas has been very prominent in supporting that campaign. In fact, she got into a lot of trouble for her wardrobe. She was in Parliament wearing a Stop Page 3 t-shirt, and she was told she had to cover it up. So that was an unacceptable wardrobe thing. Page 3 is fine, but page 3 t-shirt isn't. So I'm afraid I'm not wearing a page 3 t-shirt, but it's a cause well worth supporting and celebrating. But what I'm here today to talk about is, as the introduction said, industry policy. And again, this turns out to be a very apt day, but I didn't know when I chose this topic for today. This turned out to be a very apt day to talk about industry policy, because I think most people probably know that today we're talking about losing 1,000 jobs in Portsmouth with the closure of the BAE shipyard. We're looking at, in total, with the associated jobs, something like 20,000 jobs being affected in a city where that's one of the key industries. Now this is, for us as Greens, a slightly tricky one, because these are people making warships. And less warships isn't necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, we'd very much like to see less military spending, and particularly, we'd like to see an end to Britain's nuclear weapons. And indeed, if we got rid of Trident and didn't replace it, we would, over the lifetime of the proposed replacement, be saving £100 billion, which is money that we could really do something useful with, one way or another. But nonetheless, it is going to be a very sad day for Portsmouth, a very sad day for the area, and that's something that so many cities in the north and the Midlands of England, I'm sure I don't need to tell people in Sheffield this, have known again and again the body blow of losing industry after industry after industry. And the fact is, there was nothing inevitable about that. There was a conscious government decision to get out of industry because it was the grand theory of how Britain's economic development would run. Britain would focus on finance, the financial industries, because we're so absolutely brilliant at finance. We're so brilliant at finance that we managed to break the whole global economy. But we focus on finance, we focus on the arms industry. There are such really good ideas as selling. In the past 7 years, we've done contracts with Saudi Arabia for £4 billion worth of arms into the regime in the world that has perhaps arguably the world's worst human rights record. And pharmaceuticals, because the reality is, that's supposed to make lots of money. We still made no progress at all on the antibiotics replacements we need for the ones that are no longer useful, but we can make lots of money out of it. So the theory was that we have a British economy that was built around those three pillars of finance, pharmaceuticals and arms, with a very sort of substantial main course of retail and services. So we didn't need to make things anymore. We just focus on those things. And then in 2007 and 2008, with the financial crash, we sort of realised that perhaps that wasn't such a great idea. There was lots of problems behind that. And if you think back, I know many of you will have still been at school then, but if you think back to 2007 and 8 and even to the 2010 general election, there was a big focus on talking about how we need to bring manufacturing back to Britain. We need to restructure, rebalance the British economy. You can point to dozens of speeches that George Osborne gave saying we have to rebalance the British economy, we're going to support manufacturing and encourage manufacturing. And yet, if you look at a George Osborne speech now, somehow manufacturing has just disappeared. And if you look at what's actually happening to the British economy, we're not seeing any significant growth in manufacturing at all. What we're seeing is two things, is a boom in house prices, and something of a boom in construction, and a boom in consumer spending based on credit. Both of those are things that we know from 2007 and 2008 are not long-term sustainable functional spaces for an economy. Yet here we are with the government with the Help to Buy scheme, even though we've got banks and people from the mortgage industry, even actually the estate agents came out and said, we don't think this is a terribly good idea. Yet, inflating house prices, off we go, charging off to inflating house prices. So, I think we really need to try and have a point where we stop and think, we do need to make things in Britain. And the kind of things we need to make are actually the things we use every day, just as we need to also grow more and more of our own food. We'd ideally be making the desks we're sitting on, the shoes we're wearing, the clothes we're wearing. And yet, almost universally, we're not. And this is a problem for all sorts of reasons. It's a problem for employment. It's a problem that we don't have the sort of core of small businesses, manufacturing businesses, that's the heart of the very successful German economy. And it's a problem because, of course, we're shipping lots and lots of stuff around the world, shipping it here, very often from China and the developing world, where it's made under environmental conditions and social conditions that really don't bear much thinking about. And I'm going to think of a particular example of the kind of thing that we need to think about making in Britain. A simple t-shirt, basic clothing. Now, at the moment, you can go down to any high street store down there, any of the big chains, and you'll probably find a t-shirt for £5 or so, lower end of the market anyway. But that £5 doesn't reflect the real cost of that garment. If we think about the history of the whole story of that £5 t-shirt, it might have started off with a cotton in Azerbaijan, where it's picked by a 10-year-old who's forced each summer at harvest time out of the schools to be slave labour in the fields. It's then shipped, using fossil fuels, of course, with all of the emissions, to China, where it's spun into cloth in a factory where the dye is spewed straight out of the factory waste pipe into the nearest river. It's then shipped, fossil fuel again, down to, say, Bangladesh. And I don't think after Rana Plaza that I really need to tell anybody about the social conditions, the employment conditions for workers in Bangladesh. Then it's shipped over to Britain, fossil fuel again, into the high street store. And we think about what that high street store is like. And there was actually a study done by the Evening Standard newspaper in London recently of Oxford Street, which is a pretty good place to do a sample of the retail industry. And there were, on Oxford Street, 2 stores that were paying their retail staff a living wage, enough money to basically survive on. Most of them were paying a minimum wage, the national minimum wage. This is in incredibly expensive London. The national minimum wage and a few pennies more, just so you lifted it above, so it wasn't quite minimum wage. And that's still very much the reality today. The GMB union did a study of jobs that Next, the clothing chain, advertised in March. and 97% of those jobs were minimum wage or within a few pennies of minimum wage. They were 12.5-hour-a-week contracts or less. And there's a magic combination between those two things. You put those two figures together, and that's below the minimum at which you have to pay national insurance premiums. So we think back to that 5 quid t-shirt and think about what are all the real costs that whole way in its journey around the world, the environmental costs, the social costs, the costs in workers' pay and conditions. And you realise that that £5 t-shirt is worth, the costs of it are vastly more. And if we're going to think about bringing manufacturing back to Britain, what we need to do is make sure that the real cost of the t-shirt is reflected in the price tag. And if we do that, then if you start to think about a hypothetical alternative, grow some hemp in Kent. Don't get too excited, you can grow hemp that doesn't have any other byproducts. Hemp in Kent, spin it somewhere around there, sow it maybe, just down the road somewhere in Sheffield, sell it in a local business. And it's not going to be a 5 quid t-shirt, but it might actually be a cheaper t-shirt than that £5 one when you count in all of the real costs. Now, when I start to think about this, lots of people say, oh, but financially, this is utterly impossible. But some of this is actually starting, despite rather than because of government policy, starting to happen anyway. If you are lucky enough to have access to the FT, you might need to go to the library because you've got to have a subscription otherwise. And a search within the FT for reshoring. The independent prefers onshoring. This is the opposite of offshoring. This is industries coming back to make things in Britain. And there's 3 main reasons why this is happening. And it's not just in Britain, it's also happening very much in the US, where it's also quite well documented. First of all, in places like China, wages are going up at enormous speed. And of course they've had the one-child policy, so that cheap, young, low-cost labour isn't flowing through in the way that it was. So wages are going up to get that not that far from ours. You've got the fact that fuel prices have leapt up significantly, and given that we're at, or possibly past, peak oil, they're not going to come down again. And you've got the fact that all of those MBA geniuses who manage multinational companies have, after things like the Japanese tsunami and some very serious floods in Thailand, suddenly come to realise that actually a long global supply chain with lots of just-in-time deliveries that require things to come from all around the world to be assembled, to be shipped to a market on the other side of the world, has some real risks to it and can very easily fall apart. So what we're seeing is quite a bit of reshoring happening already. The FT says that if you're buying a jacket priced between about £80 and about £200, I think I'm talking women's clothing here, I don't know about men's, there's a very good chance that it will now actually be made in Britain, because the fact that they want a quick, reliable supply chain and it's affordable within those parameters. And my favourite example, although it's not a very green example, is pot noodles. I don't know if you saw this, but the production of at least one brand of pot noodles has moved back to Britain from China. And this is actually, I realised that I have to work on this one in an international context, because I was having a discussion with the one of the co-leaders of the European Greens, who's a German, Reinhardt, a German MEP. And I said to him, pot noodles, and he said, what? And so then I had to explain what pot noodles were, at which point he said, maybe the Chinese just didn't want to make them anymore. And I had to concede that he possibly had a point. But seriously, we have the conditions in which globalisation, the whole model that's really driven global economy over the past 20, 30 years, has clearly hit the buffers. It's hit the buffers economically, as we saw in 2007 and 8, and it's particularly hit the buffers environmentally, because of course it's got attached to it carbon emissions that we know from the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, that we cannot continue to consume the resources in the way we are to put out the carbon emissions that we've currently got. So of industry do we need? If we're coming back to thinking about Britain, one of the realities at the moment is that we're living a 3-planet lifestyle. That means collectively all of us are each year consuming the resources of 3 planets. But of course we only actually have 1 planet. We don't have, sitting over on the other side of the moon somewhere, a nice pristine one, and then we'll totally trash this one and hop over there. We've got to live within the limits of this planet. So that's one of the first things we have to think about when we think about an industrial policy. It has to work within the environmental limits. But it also, if we think about our current situation, we have in this society where we're consuming the resources of 3 planets. We have today 500,000 people dependent on food banks. 500,000 people who have to go down, accept charity to feed themselves and their children. And more than that, we have a society in which 1 in 5 workers is on less than a living wage. And perhaps this is a bit more in the news than it usually is at the moment, because this is actually Living Wage Week. There's the Living Wage Foundation puts a big focus on this week. And it is worth highlighting and really thinking about that. 20% of our workers are not being paid enough money to support themselves. Now what's happened, the history of that, if we think back over the history, is we had a Labour government over 13 years that was content and introduced the minimum wage, which was great, that was a big advance. But then it let its value slide and slide and slide, a sliding value that's only kept continuing under the Tory Lib Dem government. And what the Labour government did during that period was it brought in government benefits, particularly family tax credit and housing benefit, that ensured that workers on an adequate salary could continue to live, could continue to buy food, pay their rent, all of the essentials of life. And yet, what we've had with the current government, of course, is they're slashing those benefits away, cutting the value of those benefits, and leaving salary low. But what those benefits are, either under the current government or the previous government, is actually corporate welfare. Because it mightn't actually be written in the job description when you actually, you apply for a job, but continue to live is probably one of the requirements, that can be taken as given for any worker. You need to continue to survive, buy your food, pay your rent, and you shouldn't be a worker who actually has to depend on food banks. And that's where very many people are today. So when we think about when we're reconstructing British industry, building a different sort of society, what we need to do is make sure it creates the kind of jobs that allow people to live, that pay a living wage as an absolute minimum. And if we think about what that industrial environment kind of looks like, and we can look at the obvious model of Germany, which is working pretty well. It's built around strong local economies, it's built around small businesses and cooperatives. It's not built around big multinational companies. And what we've seen in Britain is a huge hollowing out in manufacturing, but also in other sectors of the economy, particularly retail, a loss of tens, hundreds of thousands of those small businesses that we've lost. And what we've lost with them is the strong local economies. If you kind of think about, you buy a pound bag of apples. If you buy that pound bag of apples at your local Tesco or Sainsbury's or whatever, at most a few pennies of that money stays here in Sheffield. The apples may well have come from New Zealand or South Africa. That's where the grower was paid. There's the shipping cost, of course. And here you might have one worker tending 6 self-service tills. Those wonderful things with the foreign item in the bagging area. Foreign item in the bagging area we all love so much. But they're more than just an irritation. Of course, 6 self-service tills means probably 5 jobs gone. So what you've got is, one worker tending those 6 self-service tills, getting maybe a fraction of a penny or a penny of that pound you spend on the bag of apples. And the rest of the money swooshes off out of town, out of Sheffield, quite likely off into the nearest tax haven. But if you buy a pound bag of apples from a local greengrocer where you can still find such a thing, you'll find that what she needs is, first of all, an accountant to do her tax every year. There's the basis of another local small business. When she needs a new sign, she gets a new sign writer to paint her sign. When she needs some new shelves, maybe she gets a local carpenter in to build some new shelves. Whereas Tesco's or Sainsbury's or whoever will just bring in their national contractor there for a day or two and gone again. So we need to make things, we need to sell things locally in local economies where the money goes round and round and round. And there's going to be a lot of barriers to reconstructing this. It's not going to be easy. I was talking in Oxford to someone who ticks so many boxes that it's not, I didn't make this up, I promise, but he ticks every box you can possibly imagine. He's making British furniture from British wood with lots of the upholstery made from recycled Wellington boots. It looks really lovely, actually. He melts all the colours together, so it actually looks really lovely. But he was telling me how the kind of difficulties he was having finding anyone who can still do the kind of industrial sewing that you need for upholstery. And again, you start to think about, that's a really skilled job. It's never going to be a minimum wage job. That's going to be a good, skilled manufacturing job for someone who's good with their hands to work and develop and have a career and a life based on. Because that's what we really need to do that our current economy utterly isn't delivering, which is to have jobs that you can build a life on. And of course, what you all need as students is, I would say, not start your life with a huge amount of debt, which is where I come to, another issue that I do have to mention since I'm in a university, which is the fact, I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone in this room, that with tuition fees of £9,000 a year, many, many students are going to be starting their working life, starting out trying to build a place in the world, maybe thinking they'd like to start a small manufacturing business, but they're going to be starting out with that weight of £55,000 of debt for many people sitting on their shoulders. And this is one of the reasons why the Green Party believes in zero tuition fees. Or a big zero at this point to bring the point across. And I know you've heard that before, but we believe it, and we had a fully costed 2010 general election manifesto that delivered it. And I'll always get asked, so I'll answer the question in advance, how do you pay for it? You pay for it from general taxation, because education is a public good. When you get an education, it's not just you who benefits, the whole of society is better off with the resources, the skills, the knowledge you've attained. And you shouldn't be starting life with that £55,000 debt sitting on your shoulder. And I get particularly annoyed, it is particularly Lib Dems who say this, with people who say, oh, it's all right, somewhere between 60 and 80% of people will never pay it off. So that means people go through 30 years of their life, 30 years of your life when you'd expect to be building a life, maybe settling down, thinking about buying a house, thinking about having children. And you've got that debt sitting on your shoulder. And I think one of the things that really hasn't been thought about enough, and really there hasn't even been much modelling or much work done on, is what kind of impact that's going to have in terms of economic impacts. How are you going to think about starting a business? Starting a little manufacturing business? How are you going to buy a house? How are you going to think about starting a family with that weight of debt sitting on your shoulder? And that's even without mentioning the fact that if you don't pay it all back, how does the economics of the theory all work anyway? But, sorry, that was a digression, but I had to go there. We currently have an economic model that's just very clearly broken. People say to me often, you're talking about radical change, you're talking about an entirely different sort of society, bringing manufacturing and food production back to Britain, living wage for every worker. How are we going to do this? This is a big radical change, it's a big ask. But one of the things that's very clear is that we're not going to continue as we currently are. The current system is broken, and we are going to see change. We're not going to just kind of putter along as we are now. And that's a case with the economy, and it's also, I think, a case with politics. You might have noticed that a certain gentleman called Brandt said something about politics recently, suggested that people don't vote. But, you know, I would say to you that we actually tried out, we collectively, the British citizens, tried out not voting. We tried it out with the, you may remember these, the Police and Crime Commissioner elections. These were the elections that were so successful that there was actually one polling booth in Britain where not one single voter turned up all day. The staff sat there from 7 in the morning till 10 at night and had nothing to do. That was an extreme example, but the turnout around the country, the average was about 14%. People voted with their feet and stayed away. And yet, we have police and crime commissioners elected with around 10% of the support of the entire electorate, out there making decisions, spending money, and in 3 years or so time we'll have another police and crime commissioner election when we may even break records and have an even lower turnout. But it hasn't changed anything. It hasn't made anything different. And so I've got an alternative radical suggestion for voting, which is we've been trained in Britain by the first past the post electoral system in Westminster in particular, and also local council elections, to vote for the person or the party we dislike the second most. So the party we dislike the most won't get in. And that has actually delivered us the kind of politics we've got now. The kind of politics that really isn't working, that's delivered an economic model that's failed, that's delivered a situation where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and millions are struggling to pay the rent, pay the food bills, pay the energy bills. So all of those things are there. So I've got a radical, even in Russell Brand terms, revolutionary suggestion. Vote next time for what you believe in. Look at the parties, look at their policies, look at the person who's standing, watch them on YouTube, maybe even come to a meeting like this and listen to them, and decide who you'd like to be your MP, or indeed your local councillor, and just vote for them. Don't listen to the rhetoric about two-horse races. Vote for what you believe in. And if the whole of Britain did that, we'd actually have a political revolution. Obviously, this is something that's in interests of the Green Party, and I can say that with absolute confidence, because if you look at 3 of the policies that I spend most of my time talking about, making the minimum wage a living wage, bringing the railways back into public hands, renationalising the railways, and I usually say, insert today's train anecdote here. My today's train anecdote is the fact that I had to buy a walk-up ticket for complicated diary reasons, and it cost £136 return for an off-peak ticket to London. And as a third policy, zero tuition fees. And if you like those policies, and we know that those policies have, majority, trains, 76% of people support renationalising the railways. If you vote for those policies, you will be voting Green. And you can even have a little experiment with this, because next year we have the European elections. And the European elections are a proportional representation election. We've got a very good chance here. It will only take a swing of about 1% from the last European elections to elect a Green MEP here in this region. So you can start an experiment with that. And if you like how that turns out, let's do something radical and do that in the general election in 2015 too. Because that general election for us as the Green Party is going to be different to any other general election that came before. Because in 2010, when I ran in Holborn and St Pancras in the general election, it was Camden, central London, is a very political place. So we had 10 hustings. The 4 of us, the 4 main candidates, 10 times went up against each other, debating each other, which meant I got to know a lot more about my fellow candidates, and particularly the Tory, than I ever wanted to know. But it was great. I was there, invited to all of them, got the same time as everyone else. But basically the general approach was, oh, isn't it nice? The Greens here. Oh, she talks lots of sense. Oh, she might have even won that debate. Isn't that nice? And I couldn't say to people in 2010, if you elect me as your MP, I will do this, this and this. Because everyone would have just laughed in 2010. But 2015 will be different. Because we elected Caroline Lucas as the first Green MP in 2010. And we can say to Sheffield, Holborn and St Pancras, to electorates up and down the land, if Brighton Trevilian did it, you can do it too. And I think we're also at a point where people really do want a political revolution, real political change. And, you know, we need to rebuild the British economy, British industry, British society, the British benefit system. And I would say to you that voting Green is a good place to start. Thank you. Okay, Q&A, which means someone gets to be really brave and ask the first question. Anyone feeling brave? Okay.
Something I mentioned was free tuition fees, but a major issue for students now isn't just tuition fees, but it's maintenance levels and such. For me and a lot of people I know, our maintenance level even cover the cost of our accommodation for the year, and therefore you're expecting that people depend on the parents, even though parents might have financial situations which aren't reflected in the formula that you put into student finance. And so what would the Greens do about the maintenance levels of the maintenance grant system?
I think what we'd like to go back to a full system of grants is where we'd like to go. Where we would be able to go on the spectrum of that would depend on the economic circumstances at a particular point in time. And, you know, we'll have another fully costed manifesto in 2015 that will spell that out. And I can't tell you exactly where that figure is now because, you know, that requires a lot of work. But clearly, you need enough money to live on. And I think one of the other huge issues that is for students is the fact that so many people are having to work while they're studying because they're struggling to survive. And I think, you know, the basic principle should be that you shouldn't have to rely on your parents. And you shouldn't have to work more than perhaps, you know, maybe in some cases a certain amount of work, 8 hours a week or something might even be useful. Might be useful to have that experience. But, you know, I know people who are working 20 hours a week and try to study full time as well. And that's just, you know, of course it affects their results. And it's a real equalities issue because, you know, the person with the rich parents who are just shoveling whatever money they need their way has a lot more luxurious time, has more time to study, will statistically probably get better results than the person who's really struggling and hasn't got that parental support. So I think, you know, I start with the EMA. I guess most people still remember what the EMA was. Yep, okay, lots of shakes. You know, we restore something like the EMA. The EMA wasn't perfect, but we'd like to bring back something like that and make sure that you're getting, one way or another, you're getting enough money to live on so that you don't have to work ridiculous hours. Your parents don't have to support you. And then, you know, ideally, we'd like to see that as grants, but how much we'd be able to afford that in the balance you have to look at.
Yeah, it's really nice saying that, you know, you can vote, you know, have a choice to vote Green, you should vote Green. But at the last election, in my own hometown, my constituency that I was in, there wasn't a Green candidate. And I had no option. You know, I could either vote for Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, or vote for UKIP and the MP.
I've definitely not written in the last two. Yep.
Yeah, so I had no option to vote Green. Are you planning on expanding the amount of candidates?
Well, the first thing I need to say is a kind of explanation to start this point is many people don't realise there's a £500 deposit that you have to pay to stand in a general election, and multiply that by 640 electorates or whatever it is. And the Green Party, based as we are, basically most of our funding comes from our members. We don't get money from, funding from multinational tax avoiding companies. We don't get funding from the city. That for us is a real barrier. We're also, have different strengths in different parts of the country. So the first thing I'd say to you is maybe you could be that candidate in 2015 to start off with. And that's what I say to lots of people on Twitter. If you look down my Twitter feed, you'll see me saying that quite often because that's what we actually need, is lots of people who've never thought of standing for Parliament before standing for Parliament. Make a real change from the political class. But what I would say to you is, above all, don't not go to the polling station. Because if you don't go to the polling station, you just get counted in the, happy enough so that they couldn't be bothered to take a bit of time to vote. If there's no one that you on the ballot paper that you want to vote for, my suggestion is always write a rude word on the ballot paper, because at least that way you don't get counted as the happy enough with how things are people. So, in some way or another, actually make sure you've expressed an opinion, would be my recommendation. But, think about being a candidate.
Can I just add on to that? I'm John, I'm a member of the Green Party in Sheffield. In 2014, if you happen to live in Sheffield, and students can actually vote in their university town or in their home, they can vote in the university town and their university town in the council elections. If you live in Sheffield, you will be able to vote Green, because we'll be running a candidate in every single part of the city. So, just can I say that in 6 months' time, I think it is, people who live in Sheffield, if they want to, will be able to vote Green.
And of course there will also be the European elections, where we very much can elect a Green MEP.
And when you talk about political hope and idealism, do you think that the political reality of running Brighton City Council is helpful or an albatross for your campaigning?
It's a big challenge in large part because we're a minority administration in Brighton and Hove. What that means is that we're running the council as the biggest group of councillors, but we don't have a majority on the council. So that means that we can't just get things through that are our policy. We have to actually get either Labour or Tories to vote with us on the council. And this is a huge challenge, and the place where this became most evident was in the first budget that we set, when we wanted to put up a council tax rise of about 3%. And if we put that council tax rise in, we'd have been able to set a virtual no-cuts budget. We'd have basically, with some ignoring some minor details, basically been able to maintain every service that the council was currently providing. Except because we're a minority administration, Labour voted with the Tories to vote down that council tax rise. So we had to find the savings that would take away that money that would have been available to spend on services from that. But having said that, I think we can be really proud of our Green Council in Brighton and Hove. They actually did a half-term report that just came out at the last Green Party conference that was in Brighton and Hove. And they've actually delivered, or are well on the way to delivering, 2/3 of their manifesto promises. And that means a whole range of things. And one of the things that I think we haven't sung enough about that is really impressive is GCSE results in Brighton and Hove have traditionally been absolutely dreadful compared to comparable cities, comparable places. And we've actually significantly improved GCSE results after 2 years of Green administration. We've also done lots of things that you might think of as more traditionally green, done a huge amount to encourage walking and cycling. There's a new Lewis Road bus lane that actually creates a very safe cycle route beside the bus lane that people from all around Britain are going to look at. There's a whole range of things, and of course we made Brighton and Hove a living wage council, which was one of the first councils in the country, and that was despite all the budget cuts. So there's lots of things we've achieved in Brighton and Hove that we can be proud of. It's a real challenge running things when you're in the minority administration and you can't just do what you want to do. You've got to keep negotiating. But, we've actually shown that we can run things and run things successfully and run things well. And that is definitely a positive.
Hi. Given Ed Miliband's record as Energy Secretary or Environment Secretary, whichever one he was, I can't remember, which I'm a party member, so I should know that. And given that the margin of Conservative victory over Labour candidates in some seats, like for example Lancaster and Fleetwood, was smaller than the Green vote in those seats, would it be worth investigating some local alliances in certain seats in order to install Green and Labour joint candidates?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It's probably worth off by starting off by saying that the Green Party is an entirely decentralised party. That means we don't make decisions from the centre. We can't at the centre tell any local party to do anything pretty well. I mean, if we have a local party that suddenly decides they want to double the number of nuclear weapons or something, we might step in. But ignoring the extreme cases, if there were local decisions to be made, local decisions could be made. And I think, I find it hard to imagine a joint Green Labour candidate, but it's not impossible to imagine a situation where one party decides to focus on taking one seat off the Tories and the other party decides to focus on another seat, and you come to some kind of, informed arrangement like that is definitely within the range of possibilities. But I think, some people sometimes say that we're just like old Labour, or you're just a bit more radical form of Labour. But, and one of the questions I often get asked is, are you a socialist? To which my answer is that I have lots of socialist ideas that people call socialist, but no, I'm a green. The clues in the name kind of thing. And, you know, we believe in a radically different kind of society, and I'm afraid I really don't think that today's Labour Party does believe in a radically different sort of society, which is a pretty major barrier to that sort of thing.
What is the Green Party's position on the European Union and why?
Okay, very easy, simple outline to remember, which is 3 yeses. We say yes to there being a referendum. Not that we necessarily call for one, but now that there's one on the table, we believe in democracy and self-determination. If it's good enough for the Scots, it's probably good enough for us. We would say vote yes to staying in the European Union at that referendum, because Europe is really important to be there as a kind of foundation of standards. Europe provides a foundation of environmental standards, provides a foundation of workers' rights standards, provides a foundation of consumer standards. I didn't do so well on horse meat, but hey, keep working on that one. Provides a foundation of human rights standards. And what you do is, if you have a union that guarantees those basic standards, then countries can't burrow under their neighbours, burrow down by cutting their workers' standards, and, you know, undercut their neighbours by doing that. You set those standards as a basis. And because the European Union is big enough as one of the world's major markets, you can try and make those the global standards and have some real impact on making those global standards. So the EU is really important for that. But we would also say yes, the third yes, is to reform. And when I say reform, what I pretty well mean is 180 degrees opposite to what David Cameron means when he says reform. He wants to make it easier for multinational companies to trade. He wants a really loose US-EU free trade agreement. And he wants to entirely get rid of the Working Time Directive. I want the opposite of all of those things. The kind of reform that I want to see in Europe is particularly, it's written into the principle of the Lisbon Treaty. It's a really nasty sounding word, but subsidiarity. The principle that decisions should be made at the lowest possible local level by the people affected by that decision. And Brussels has been much too centralised, much too focused on Brussels. It needs to let go with lots of things, let the decisions be made locally, but while maintaining that foundation of basic standards underneath those decisions. And one of the things I would say to you, just particularly because of my experiences the past week, is you'll read lots of things about the European Union. And if you read something and think, that doesn't sound like it can be true, it almost certainly isn't true. I had the fortune or misfortune to be on the Daily Politics last Friday with a guy called Peter Bone, who's a Tory MP, for which the word dinosaur might have been invented if it wasn't already taken by something else. He's a very, very anti-EU man. And the topic was the size of toilet flushes. So, of course, the two of us sitting in a very small BBC studio have a large picture of a toilet bowl behind us. Being leader, you really get to do all the fun jobs. And what had actually happened, the facts of the matter were that the EU has an eco-label scheme by which it identifies standards for a whole lot of things that can get an European eco-label that means it's met environmental standards. And they announced the eco-label standard for toilet flushes, which was 4 litres. But the British current standard is 5 litres. And so Peter Bone was there to say, you know, the EU is going to come marching into your toilet and inspect your toilet. Which is not at all the case. We have a voluntary system for manufacturers that will make it easier for them to have a standard that people will recognise. So that's the kind of reporting that you often encounter about the EU. So if you do read something about the EU and think gore, go and check it out, because there's an awful lot of nonsense out there.
Hi Natalie, I agree with a lot of your critique of the current economic model, which most certainly is broken. Where I suspect I disagree is over what to do next. I mean, I'll take your idea of reconstructing local economies, which I think is great, but in my view that's only going to work if economic decision-making in Britain is under public control. And the problem we've got in this country is that most of the economic decision-making is under private control. And I'm thinking here of the giant multinational corporations, you know, they're privately owned. And they're causing lots of problems, because they're hoarding £750 billion of money, which they won't invest because there's so little demand. And they're causing problems for small businesses, because they're running them into the ground. Small businesses can't compete with them. So we've got town centres being hollowed out, and we've got pawn shops and betting shops coming in. So I'd like to see the Green Party committing itself to taking the major corporations into public ownership. But we can't just have public ownership, we've got to have public control, so that we can then decide what to produce, how much to produce. If we want to pay people decent wages, we can do that. If we want to produce things within environmental limits, then we can do that as well. So for me, the future of British industry is an industry that's publicly owned and publicly controlled.
Well, I think where I think we definitely differ is that sounds like a very centralising model, a model of things being decided, a control economy from the centre. A real principle of green philosophy is localism. Decisions being made locally, local decisions being made by people affected. And in terms of tackling the power of big multinational companies, I think we're starting to see a shift around on this. I mean, one of the big ways in which Sainsbury's or Tesco or any of those other kind of companies have a big advantage over your local store, or Starbucks is another one that comes to mind, advantage over your local coffee shop, is Joe's coffee shop probably doesn't have 16 subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands, where somehow or other that's where most of his profits end up. So what we need to do is, the rise of the multinational companies, and there's nothing inevitable about that. That's a result of our previous policy decisions, our previous decisions to allow them to evade taxes, to allow them to be extremely poor corporate citizens, to pay a minimum wage or a living wage, to use 0 hours contracts, all of those things. We decided to allow that to happen, and we can change our mind and stop that happening, to rebalance the field. And I think we can see some of this, we're certainly seeing a shift in public opinion. I mean, I was talking about when I was running in 2010, one of the big things that I said pretty well like a mantra was, we will make multinational companies pay their taxes. And in 2010, when I said that, particularly when I said it to journalists, they do that kind of thing that the plumber does when they look at your boiler. They step back, suck in through their teeth, and the plumber says, oh, that's going to be expensive. And the journalist says, well, making multinational companies pay your taxes. You can't say that to British voters, that's too radical. And yet, of course, we've had the brilliant campaigns of UK Uncut and Occupy, a whole shift in public opinion. And actually, I think it was it 2012, I think it was, that David Cameron stood on the steps of Davos and said, I'm going to make multinational companies pay their taxes. Of course, he didn't actually mean it, he was just saying it. And in fact, George Osborne has changed the tax law to make it easier to avoid taxes and leave money in subsidiaries in tax havens. But we have seen a shift in public opinion there. And, it's possible to actually decide to make multinational companies pay their taxes. It's also possible, if you look at just how incredibly bad corporate citizens those big multinational chains are. If you look at all those Tesco's, Mini and Sainsbury's, Metro or whatever they're called, all those little ones, often in quiet suburban streets, small little lanes of shops. And they don't have a storeroom. If you go into one of those, have a look around. There's usually no storeroom. What they do is they have a just-in-time supply chain, and they have 3 or 4 times a day an HGV draws up outside, fills up 4 or 5 car parking spaces, sits there, unloads trolleys onto the pavement, and because there's no storeroom, those trolleys will sit there until the next HGV comes to go away again. And the stuff will get loaded straight onto the shelves. They get some parking tickets, they just consider that a cost of doing business. And I actually spent some time opposite one of these stores, and they used to cone off the space where the HGV arrived 24/7. And for a while we played, this was a Green Party pop-up shop, and for a while we played this fun game where we took the cones away and they put the cones back, which was fun, although it got a bit boring eventually. But, we just let those companies literally trample all over our communities. And we can decide to stop doing that. And if we stop that happening, then we start to rebalance back towards the small and towards the local and give them an even chance. So I would say you don't make the command from the centre, you create the possibilities from the base. One of the other interesting examples, actually, I was having an email discussion about this tonight. There's the Sustainable Communities Act, which allows for the possibility of local communities to decide to put a levy on big supermarkets, reflecting the damage that they do to their communities. And we've had, in a number of Green parties up and down the country who've been promoting this, and in Bristol they got furthest down the track, and they didn't eventually win a voting council to bring it in. But that's an idea that's growing and spreading, and I'd urge you to look up the Sustainable Communities Act, and they've got a whole campaign where you can sign up to lobby your local councillors to do this. So what we've got to do is rein in, stop those companies running wild. And as I said, we let that happen, we can stop it happening. There's nothing inevitable about it. Sorry, that was a very long answer. But
you said one in 5 workers that don't have the living wage. Is that the government's own figures?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask it because I've been reading various sources and newspapers and all the rest of it. One of the problems that the Green Party has, and also Labour to a certain extent, the present government seems to be very choosy about what figures they release to the general public, and it's very hard to justify with it without getting the statistics. I feel that this is something that the Green Party ought to press more for, because if there isn't transparency in the government figures, or from some other source, then you can't talk proper politics. You can only start talking Daily Mail politics, which is not my idea of politics at all.
I entirely agree with that one. Well, I mean, it's interesting actually that the National Audit Office has actually done quite often rapped the government over the knuckles about the way it's released figures and some of the claims it's made about the figures. So there is some kind of check on it. But I think, there is a huge problem with the whole broad issue of governance. And actually, this is sort of related to this, but I'll just tell it because I think it's an interesting story. Caroline Lucas had an amendment yesterday in Parliament. It was a really radical amendment. Apparently the whips from both parties were absolutely horrified, because what the amendment would have done would have ensured that each amendment that parliamentarians, that MPs were voting on, each amendment would just have a sentence explaining what it was and what it did. Because at the moment, lots of amendments say things like, remove section B47X and replace with the following words, L, B, C, D, F. And MPs vote on that. And of course there's vast amounts of business in the House of Commons, and most of them haven't sat down with the old Act and the new proposed bill and compared the two and worked out what all of that means. They just vote the way the whips tell them. The Labour whip or the Tory whip or the Lib Dem whip says go that way or go that way, and they do. And Caroline was actually introducing an amendment that would have required each amendment to just have a sentence explaining what it did, what the actual effect was. And that got voted down comprehensively yesterday. I think if you look at the Twitter feed, Caroline was quite angry about it. And I don't blame her. Because, that, in terms of the troubles of governance that we've got now, is a pretty fair demonstration of, we'd be talking about broken economics, but also broken politics.
Yeah, I appreciate your bringing in the issue of ethical purchasing. We face a dilemma when it comes to China. Because China, because we're so price-driven, are producing photovoltaic panels very cheaply because the government subsidizes it. And it's knocking out all competition. But yet, we're not questioning their ethics in purchasing the panels. It's a dilemma. How can we overcome that? Because it's a question I didn't want to. I'd rather be asking it of another head of a political party than yourself. I want to say that because I am a member, and I don't want us to put this in any less of a position because it's so hard to move forward. It's a dilemma.
I think it's a whole area we've got to move in hugely, and solar panels are a particularly tricky one because goodness knows we need solar power. So I'm going to park the solar panels for a moment and go back to something that's actually means something to everyone in this room, which is your phone.
phone, the Fairphone, you mean?
But now, I mean, I don't know how much you've seen, or your iPhone or your iPad or your whatever device you want to think of. And if you've actually seen some of the information, I mean, The Guardian had a really good report recently about the use of interns in Foxconn, which makes iPhones and lots of other brands as well. I'm not picking any particular brands out here. And they've got something like 16,000 students, high school students, in sort of upper end of high school, who come and are forced to work for the whole summer holidays on the factory line, unpaid. And you've got, there was a lot of publicity a couple of years ago about the kind of suicides at Foxconn. And I'm actually doing some work with an organisation called Congo Calling now, because you go back further down the supply chain, and your phone will contain a whole lot of rare minerals from the Congo, produced by what are rather euphemistically called artisan miners, which basically means a man or a child with a pick and shovel, carrying a sack on their back out of the jungle for a couple of days. So we've got huge problems with so many things all along our supply chain, and mobile phones are a good example. And you mentioned, and I urge everyone to Google and look at Fairphone, which is going to be the first fair trade phone that's in production now. But what we need to do actually is look at, and what I'm working with Congo Calling on, and I'm told the National Union of Students and Exeter University are among the first to actually have an ethical IT purchasing policy. And at the moment you can't buy entirely ethical IT, but they're going to ask the questions, they're going to put pressure on the companies, they're going to say and try and create a market for those ethical products. So, we need to swing the supply chain over. And that's not something you can just do like that. We can't do it with phones, we can't, we're all dependent on their phones. I certainly couldn't live without mine. So, but we've got to look at that. And again, I started talking about the £5 t-shirt. Actually make sure that the real externalised costs that we don't pay now are reflected in the price, because we are actually paying that price eventually now. But we're just paying it in a different way for money.
Well, and Apple are doing other clever stuff. I just already heard yesterday they're going to be mechanizing and computerizing and robotizing the making of the phones and their products, so they don't have to worry about as many people dying or committing suicide. I've added that part.
Well, yes, and of course you get the question of, we talk a lot about productivity and efficiency. And I would urge you, if you want to explore those kind of issues more, there's an excellent book, Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth. And if you want to look at sort of how we explore both what's wrong with our current system and how we move to a new one, it's a really good one to read. We need to change it all. Simple.
You were talking about the supermarket checkout tills. Do you really think it's a bad thing to make working more efficient, and so the shop can run with less people?
Less people, less jobs.
You've got to think about the quality of jobs as well as the quantity, surely.
Well, yeah, you do, and there is a problem with the whole supermarket model, the whole production line model, which is kind of what the supermarket model is. And I'll give you an example of what it can be like working on a till that's different. Because I'm a member of a cooperative called the People's Supermarket in central London. It's been on various television shows, so some people might have seen a bit about it. So it's owned by its customers, and it's to a large degree run by customers. So I'm a member of the cooperative, so I do my 4 hours a month on the till. I'm somewhat an inefficient till person because lots of people start political conversations with me, which does mean that I'm a bit slow sometimes. And because I only do it for 4 hours a month, I'm rather bad at holding a political conversation and operating the till at the same time. Both of them is a bit much, but I have fun going for my 4 hours a month. We're utterly unmechanised. It's a fairly basic till. We actually still have a rather complicated system whereby you weigh them on the scales over there and then you type in the figure you've got over here, and it's very low tech. But I enjoy it. It's fun. And, yes, the supermarket model, checkout chick in the terminology might be having a lot of fun, but you can structure a whole store very differently that, employs lots of people and they enjoy themselves.
Right. I know there's all the rhetorical basically about the market economy and everything at the moment. That's really important. But I know in the news recently, there was something about the Conservatives wanting to make a nuclear plant and change energy and the way we get it, and apparently there's now a crisis of energy prices. So I'm just wondering what you guys think about energy and where it's going to come from.
Yep. Energy policy is a big subject, and I'll try not to take too much time on it. But what we would say first of all about energy policy is the entirely missing segment, the utterly unsexy segment that we don't talk about and absolutely must, is energy conservation. I was actually doing a talk with a whole lot of energy industry analysts, you know, sort of accountants and technical people and all of that. Last week it was in the city in London. We were up on the 7th floor, and to start off talking about energy conservation, I said, just look around this room. And it was about 8 o'clock in the evening. We looked around, and everywhere around us were office blocks lit up like Christmas trees. Empty office blocks with the lights blazing away. But even more importantly than that, we have the leakiest, most inefficient homes in pretty well all of Europe. £1 in 4 that we spend on heating our homes either goes straight up through an uninsulated ceiling or straight out through a drafty window or door. So first of all, what we need to get serious about with energy is energy conservation. And if you think about it, insulation is the simplest and easiest option. A big, full-scale, government-funded insulation scheme would create a whole heap of jobs, and they'd be good jobs because they'd last for decades, because it's going to take us decades to fix the housing, no matter how fast we go. They tackle fuel poverty. Not very far from here in Huddersfield, there's a guy called Councillor Andrew Cooper, who's known in the Green Party as Mr. Insulation. He's practically single-handedly responsible for insulating, the last count I heard was 55,000 homes in Huddersfield. And those people are saving about £230 a year on their energy bills. So, insulation tackles fuel poverty, creates jobs, and cuts carbon emissions. And that should be number one, step one in energy policy, before you do anything else. Second step is, we have got a whole lot of electricity plants that are closing in the next few years. We do need to replace them. We believe, and lots of other people in the industry believe too, that renewable energy, wind, solar, and eventually tidal is definitely the way to go. Because one of the things about those is that you can start the project and you know what the costs will be. One of the alternatives is gas. And you probably will have heard about George Osborne's dash for gas, fracking and all the rest of it. And, except, one of the things that George Osborne and David Cameron won't tell you about gas, and Ed Davey, the Lib Dem Energy Secretary, who said, astonishingly, I love shale gas. And he didn't say it by accident, because he said it twice. The International Energy Agency predicts that by 2020 the gas price will have risen by 40%. So by the end of this decade, 40% increase in gas prices. So that's the high cost and volatile. If there's a global price for gas, you have no control over it. That's not the way to go. Whereas, wind, solar, tidal, the fuel, if you want to look at it that way, the wind, the sun, the tide, is always going to cost nothing. So that's where we need to go. In terms of nuclear, many people will be aware that the Green Party has been opposed to nuclear for decades. And we've traditionally been opposed to it on two grounds, which is we don't know what to do with the waste. We have no plan to deal with the waste. And secondly, we have, things can go horribly wrong, as we saw at Fukushima. But that's one of those debates that people have been having for decades and tend to be fixed in one position or the other. And I can actually partner that. And I don't have to go back to those old arguments. I can look at two arguments about why we shouldn't be going nuclear. One is the cost. And looks like we're heading towards building Hinkley C. We're looking at guaranteeing double the price that energy is now. But even if we park the price question, the last two plants like Hinkley C have taken to bring online, from when you started building them to bring them online to the grid, have taken 17 years to bring online. Now we desperately need to cut carbon emissions now. The IPCC tells us we've got to really start cutting carbon emissions now. 17 years is just way, way too slow. So nuclear, I think, is not the answer. You can just simply go to the time argument and park all of the others.
Do you think it might be difficult to achieve moving away from multinational corporations and achieving a living wage at the same time? Because if you move away from multinational corporations, then you're losing the economies of scale, which you don't have necessarily in local firms. So if there's not economies of scale, then things obviously cost more, and even if you move wages up, you'll have to move them up even further to cover the inflationary cost of moving away from the corporations.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is, and the thing is, it's all a package, because you're creating those opportunities, you're creating new skilled jobs, you're creating different kinds of jobs. It's not the case that, you know, your local supermarket chain, or indeed, you know, the giant manufacturing plant that's making the t-shirts in Bangladesh, you're not transporting them here. You're entirely changing the model and the way things work. But we are also talking about things that really are utterly transformatory and different, because we're not going to get from 3 planet living to 1 planet living simply or easily. And there will be less, put it simply, less stuff in our life. And, you know, you may not be flying to Prague for the stag weekend. I'm sure no one would do that. But anyway, and one of the things that you start to think about how this starts to look differently. I mean, Green Party policy is that the standard working week should be a 35-hour working week as standard. But the New Economics Foundation has been doing a lot of work, and if you're interested in this, I'd urge you to read their latest book that's just out. Looking at the idea that you can actually reduce working hours much further than that. Their idea is eventually bringing the standard working week down to 21 hours. And what you're having is a trade-off between time and stuff. You have less stuff in your life. And when I say less stuff, I mean, you know, I was talking about the 5 quid t-shirt before. We all know that the 5 quid t-shirts last 3 washes and then ends up looking like a rag. Maybe the £20 t-shirt lasts for 2, 3, 4, 5, how many years? So you start to trade off with quality. Maybe you also get a trade-off with time. And you get more time in your life, but you have less stuff, less money as well. And that's the kind of trade-off if you start to think about reshaping the whole economy. And if you think this sounds radical, you can actually go back to Keynes, who in the 1940s thought that we'd be working a 20-hour week by now. Because we'd get enough, we'd get a sufficiency of stuff in our life. He couldn't imagine the consumer boom that's driven the last 20, 30, 40 years. We'd get to enough and then we'd start to say, maybe we could think about progress that instead of thinking about growth in GDP, which has got an enormous number of problems attached to it, if instead you thought each year we have progress that the working week gets, say, 15 minutes shorter. Every 4 years you get an extra hour in your life every week. And if you think about that, as Caroline Lucas says, no one lies on their deathbed and says, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. You actually get more living in your life, and that might be a trade-off.
How many seats can the Green Party, on their current estimates, realistically win in the 2015 general election?
I have absolutely no idea. I will tell you that in the European election next year, we've got a very realistic possibility of going from 2 MEPs to 6 MEPs. There's actually was a YouGov poll out about 6 weeks ago that put us on 12% in the European poll, which would give us that figure. But I think, you know, they say a week is a long time in politics. I think if you look at the current febrile state of British politics, you know, I'm not going to put a figure on it. What I can tell you is that we're aiming to have 10 advanced constituencies up and down the country, places where we're running really good, strong campaigns. And then we'll see what happens. Okay, yep.
I'm basically the university and I went to one of the lectures where we talked about the future of sustainability. And obviously industrialised farming is not obviously sustainable given how it relies on pesticides. Organic farming comes from hope, like the level of food required. So their policy was working with genetically engineering
So I'm just what's the Green Party position on genetic modification?
We're not opposed to research into genetically modified organisms. We are opposed to the release of them into the environment. And I think there's a basic problem in the model that you were describing there, is because GM is currently controlled by the Monsantos of this world. We're talking about big industrial scale farming. To do the GM, you take one particular variety, say of corn, and you do the genetic modification, and then you produce that on a huge scale. What we would say in terms of increasing production, getting really localized production, getting really production that can survive knocks, drought, diseases, change, is you need a really diverse genetic stock. Now, my first degree is agricultural science, so I can go on about this for hours, but I won't. But it's not so long ago that a farmer would plant in that boggy bit of the field one variety of wheat, in that dry corner of the field a different variety of wheat, in this stony corner that variety, and there's lots of manure being in that corner because that's where the cows gather, so you put another variety there. And that kind of farming can actually be vastly more productive and vastly more resilient because you've got genetic diversity in there. GM implies very limited genetic diversity. To do the GM, the genetic modification process, you're going to end up with relying on a very few number of varieties. And there is just no magic bullet in GM, and it has to be inevitably associated with big-scale industrial farming. GM and organic don't go together. Gentleman behind you.
I was going to say something about canes, but yeah, you got that for me. As well as there's obviously a link between overworking and the sort of over expenditure on energy. Or do you agree there's also a link between that and the over debts? Basically, I think the world's total debt is about 300% of the world's total GDP. I think I saw something a while ago saying at the recent Green conference you adopted saying that a Green government would end fractional reserve banking and bring money supply under the control of governments. Do you think that's something that needs more attention in the monetary system, something that needs more attention in politics?
I do. I'm aware of the fact that it's now 7 minutes to 8 and it's very late to start on the whole monetary system. This is the first time I've attempted this, so this is a very attempt to do this in a fairly short and simple way. Currently, most money that's in our supply is created by the banks. When they give you a loan, let's say you've gone out there in the world, you're bearing the weight of student debt on one shoulder, and you decide to take on the debt of a mortgage on the other shoulder, and they create a £100,000 loan for you. They're actually creating that money. The whole idea of a new kind of system is that money should only be created by the state, by an independent organ of the state, operating a bit like the Bank of England, and that it should aim to ensure that you've got enough money, but not the kind of inflationary money that we've had, say, from quantitative easing, which has overwhelmingly gone into financial markets. Not the kind of debt-driven housing bubble, internet bubble, all the bubbles we've seen in the past. So there is a whole recognition that our current system is broken, we need to change it. I had a very interesting discussion with the people, the researchers behind this a couple of weeks ago, and there's a whole set of policies that fit together, which is, I'm not going to explain them all now, but basic income or citizens' income, sovereign money, and land value tax. And you put those together and we're looking at a whole different economic model. And if you're interested in this, I urge you to go away and Google those things and you'll find out a lot more. But we are heading into utterly transformatory times. And I think one of the things that's worth saying that, I've talked about some radical changes. And most of us as humans have a pretty short memory. But if I look back as to when I was when I look back at my grandparents, they lived a life where my grandmother would never have heard the word environment, I suspect. And she didn't think about recycling. But she reused old bread bags that the bread came in. She saved rubber bands. She saved wrapping paper and reused it. She grew most of her fruit and veg in her own backyard. And I think one of the key things is they had a whole home that was furnished with furniture that they bought when they got married. And that furniture was still there when they celebrated their golden wedding anniversary 50 years later. And that furniture they fully expected to pass on to their child. Of course, we moved into different times and we had lots of lovely stuff from IKEA instead. But we've seen massive change over the past few decades in the way our whole economy and society works. Where we are now is not some sort of long-term fixed point. We've had massive change. We're going to see massive change in the future. Lots of the things that you're learning now at university will be utterly out of date in 10 or 20 years' time. Lots of things I learned at university were utterly out of date in 10 or 20 years' time. And, we're going to see change. And I was actually speaking at the student assembly, part of the People's Assembly movement on Saturday, and I started with them with an apology for saying, for my generation to your generation, all I can say is I'm sorry, because we've left you one hell of a mess to clean up. But that's also left you with a real opportunity to build a different kind of society, a fairer kind of society, a new society that you can shape. So, you can start on the money system if you like. I think that's probably enough. I think we're out of time. Thank you.